Of course, to everybody watching.
I've never seen anything like it.
The terrorist attack in New York City that claimed the lives of thousands and forever changed the New York skyline was an event that America will never forget. Playing on repeat as a singularity for American TV audiences, the event that came to be known simply as 9/11 created a new origin story for many Americans. From 9/11 and the tragedy that occurred on that day spawned a renewal of the American ideals of freedom and opportunity, but with it came fear and hate. Alongside the traumatic images of death and destruction, a desire for an answer came as well, which led many to a with us or against us mindset. Any criticism of the USA was to be somehow aligned with the terrorists, creating a massive wave of Islamophobic rhetoric and stigma in the years after 9/11. To see the acts of the US government as inherently selfless, benevolent, or even divinely inspired, as Peter Bruno puts it in his master's thesis at CUNY, is to then see the acts of the terrorists as evil and wicked. The effects of associating America with good and the terrorists as bad can be seen in Hollywood releases after 9/11. By far, the biggest effect can be seen in the blockbuster action superhero genre. In the wake of 9/11, Hollywood saw a massive shift in how it portrayed war and destruction. This pit of morality can be seen both in the ways things are destroyed and the way things are saved in these movies. Visually, destruction of buildings in movies before 9/11 almost always had an unreal-looking and cartoonish physics to it, even considering the dated effects of the time. Skyscrapers in movies before the tragedy stayed intact, breaking in weird ways and would collapse at even the slightest force. Post 9/11, however, we see shots reminiscent of the news footage of 9/11 that features buildings standing for some time before crumbling, smoke filling the air, and a focus on civilians running for cover. Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice from 2016 harbors especially uncanny parallels to eyewitness footage from that day.
This quadrant is unsafe. Please back away. We are here to help. This quadrant is unsafe. Please back away. Please back away. We wish to avoid collateral damage and will inform you when this current conflict is resolved. We are here to help. We are here to help.
In many superhero movies' attempts to present widespread destruction not unlike 9/11, we see what seems to be attempts to remaster the trauma from that day. Many have argued that the Avengers 2012 is an attempt to do so, having the Stark Tower be a stand-in for the World Trade Center. Or as Jeffrey Brown writes in his book The Modern Superhero in Film and Television, just as Rambo asked if he was allowed to win this time when returning to Vietnam, the Avengers demonstrate that through superheroes the nation is allowed to vicariously win 9/11 this time. There's also something to be said about how victims, or lack thereof, are shown in these films. We see tons of collateral damage and dramatic destruction of places that find themselves between the forces of good and evil. However, the audience is rarely given cues to show who's actually being fought for on these battlefields. One might notice an empty city effect, as stated in Peter Bruno's thesis from before, where the people who live in these buildings are nowhere to be found or are neglected for the sake of action. Bruno argues that this contributes to perpetuating America's false beliefs in the clean wars she fights without mistakes, and this affects the viewer by making them feel bad about the deaths in the movies only when they're in relation to the characters of the heroes, and not for the cities or the civilians to be forgotten by the masses. By leaving this piece out, the effect is given that everyone gets saved, letting only the bad guys die and sparing innocent civilians. Iron Man 2008 makes an almost comical example of this, where the hero's mechanical suit uses special technology to identify and kill only the terrorists and spares the innocent townspeople. It's interesting to note that in these films, during the action, there are few to none as far as implied or acknowledged deaths. We see that in the Avengers 2012, New York is attacked by an army of alien invaders with no deaths shown or implied. Man of Steel 2013 has a city entirely torn apart with the inhabitants conveniently avoiding death. Iron Man 2 from 2010 has a fully populated convention center shot at by drones with no attendees hit. The Dark Knight 2008 features a hospital being bombed without establishing anyone inside. Justice League from 2017 features what seems to be several towns being completely leveled with no human setting established whatsoever. Two prime examples come to mind when thinking about superhero films where there's no deaths implied on screen, only for the deaths to be addressed in the follow-up movies. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice from 2016 has a brief scene where they imply that many people died during the events of Man of Steel in 2013, whereas the only death we can maybe see in that movie is a man praying inside a collapsing building. Avengers Age of Ultron from 2015 goes out of its way to imply that the Avengers evacuated the entire fictional city of Sokovia before destroying it, only to show that later there were indeed many casualties, as is the driving conflict of Captain America Civil War from the following year. This is all to say that American filmmaking in the superhero genre has been directly impacted by the way the US government wants us to see how we fight our wars. Bloody, violent, or unnecessary deaths aren't marketable or profitable, showing that war as an act of heroism is a way to enable the exertion of force. Historically, we can see that these visual examples parallel the goings-on in the real world around the time. The U.S. military used the portrayal of 9/11 as an attack on Western ideals and culture as a whole to fuel the seemingly arbitrary war on terror. By omitting crucial context about the Middle East and America's involvement in the area, the narrative of good versus evil is propped up with ideas of the West versus cultural others and civilized versus barbaric. These ideas permeate through American culture, and we're able to see it in our film culture.